Hey everyone, and thank you for tuning in to Coffee with Klingman, where I talk with some of the most interesting people I know over a damn good cup of joe. Today in the cafe, I have Austin Grisham talking about the necessity of working through loss. Austin, welcome back.
Thanks, man.
Absolutely.
Good to be here.
I am so stoked. So I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I learned that you went over to Africa for a good stint, good chunk of time. So what are some of the stuff you did while you were there?
My first trip over was to Mozambique in South Africa when I was 19 or 20. I was 20.
I know you got the memory.
A little math. Yes, it was in 2006.
Okay.
But I'd been invited to go on kind of a organizational development trip. There was a group of people in my hometown who were interested in starting a nonprofit. I went with them to kind of give my feedback on the experience of what they wanted to create. I think they wanted to really go about opportunity in creating partnerships to help improve some of the quality of life and like different pieces. I mean, in time, the initial reason I went, in hindsight, I'm not very proud of, mostly because I have a very different perspective on what we do in other people's countries and homes. I think that like there was a component of the initial work that I was a part of that probably would fall under a degree of a white savior complex that I'm pretty critical of at this stage, and I've been for years.
Was that something that you had, that perspective, something you had before you went, or something you learned after?
I mean, it was something that I had before I went to a degree. I mean, obviously we like learn in layers and in pieces as we like develop. And I think when I had gone originally, I had been a part of some volunteer work when I was in high school. I'd been to developing countries. I had seen the value in community-based efforts to create change, whether that was for education or faith-based work to build up a community, economic development, whatever that could look like. I had been a part of more like low-income communities in the United States, some work in Mexico, some other places, and had an idea of like, I was kind of sorting out like what feels appropriate, what feels inappropriate, what really helps people, what just makes people feel like they're going somewhere and they get to pat themselves on the back and be like, I helped poor people, and it's like, that is just such a distraction from the real need of approaching people with care, listening, really looking to local perspectives for their needs if you really want to come in as an outsider to a community to help. And hopefully it's actually help, not help. There's actually a great book that was written by a professor at Covenant College in Chattanooga, Tennessee, called When Helping Hurts. And it's really a perspective. It's built on a faith-based perspective, so built around kind of traditional mission work that's more geared toward proselytizing and conversion of people to a faith, but looking at that from a kind of a critical model of saying like, what are we doing that isn't hurting people, and how are we really helping people from like an economic perspective, from an education perspective, from a healthcare perspective. And I think some of those things that I learned in time added value to that experience, and looking at that experience somewhat critically, but then to try to do that better and be a part of more appropriate work and things that I felt like would be helping people for the long term, which came about years and years later in being able to kind of revisit some of those experiences through my own professional work and things like that.
Got you. So what is some of those lines that you were able to draw?
I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with listening, I think, is a priority. We need to approach and listen to what people's needs are. Obviously, we live in a pretty complex, accessible world now in terms of you don't have to go somewhere to see it. You can see it on the internet, you can see videos, you can see pictures. It's not that, definitely doesn't give you enough education to be knowledgeable on a region or community in the world. But I think that there's a piece to all of those experiences that has to be like, if you really have a vision to help people in the world, what we really need to be asking is like, what do these people want first? Do they want our help? Do they truly need our help? That's relative, right? Like, it's not hard to look at people and say like, I have X or you have X and I don't have X and you don't have X and this is what you need, or who determines what I need? I determine that. So I think that a lot of it has to do with really looking at, from a relative perspective, relatively, what does someone need or want? And that's different when you're talking about like obviously basic needs, place to live, food, water, healthcare. Some of those pieces are a little different. Like if people aren't experiencing those, obviously that's a critical need that could affect their livelihood immediately. And that's more of like, you know, in disaster response or conflict zones or, you know, those necessary pieces. But when you're looking at, I think like part of me, everything becomes kind of, I think it's interesting because it kind of becomes, we talk about things like development from a like statistical standpoint and becomes like somewhat just like data rather than like
ambiguous and with the numbers.
Yeah, and it's not really taking like the human element of like these are people's lives and livelihoods and their well-being is at stake depending on how we choose to work with them or what we choose to do.
You hear a lot about some big CEOs making a lot of those same decisions all based on the numbers and not seeing like the lives that are actually impacted in some of the big decisions that are made.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, and when you're talking about a developing country, you know, like even saying that, like even the word developing country, like we obviously create standards for like what is and isn't a developing country. A lot of people use terms like third world country or, you know, there's like a million terms people can pull out of the air to describe these places. But like ultimately, I think when we look at how we want to help in the world, we really do need to be asking questions. We need to be listening. We need to hear what people really want and need from their perspective. I mean, there's obviously a lot of critique with international development on getting clean water to people and putting in systems. There's like kind of like classic case studies too that people would always talk about in places like East Africa. Big projects like global projects funded by big groups, and it's like, okay, say someone comes in and puts in a well in a village, right? So you live in this village, you don't have adequate drinking water. There's issues with water accessibility, sanitation, infectious disease, things like that. So you come into a place like that, and you're there, and it's kind of like, hey, do you want clean water? It's like, maybe so. So if you say yes, we want clean water. So like if we come in and we like put in a well as like a charitable contribution to the community, but like if we don't, like what if we like come in and install the well, put all this money into it, and then like leave? Have we trained you to work on the well? Have we given you accessibility to tools and to all of the different pieces and components of that well like you're going to need to repair and have maintenance and like all these things? And so it's like kind of like that was a common like kind of case study to look at the way we approach development, which is like, you have a need, I'm charitable, I want to meet it, I go home back to my normal world, and you get the thing I gave you, we're all good, except we're not all good.
Yeah, just throwing money at the problem doesn't solve that.
Yeah, and it's money or it's a solution or a product or something like that doesn't do it. And I think a lot of it, for me on a personal level, has to do with personal relationships. And beyond that, it has to do with actually like providing education, knowledge, and tools to help meet communities' needs, whether that's economic, whether it's health, water, all of those different pieces play roles in that. And a lot of people, I think, mean well when they want to help people, but I think we have to look at things more critically and internalize, hey, if I was in this situation and people came to my community and I was without certain things, how would I want to be approached, to be brought in, to be cared for, or seemingly helped, if that wasn't something I wanted or needed? And I mean, in addition to that, you know, there is just a common, I feel like there's like this kind of commonality in terms of the critique of certain ways of going into communities, and just does not need to be approached with any sort of savior complex, because we're all people. And I think it's more of approaching people with care and thoughtfulness, and being able to listen, process with people, figure out their needs. And it took me many, many years and experiences of not doing that I really regret now, because of the people who are also leading certain things I was a part of. And then in time, I was able to articulate and learn better, more appropriate ways to be involved with communities and doing storytelling and really listening to what people's needs were. I worked with entrepreneurs in Zambia who are starting small businesses. I worked with an organization that supported small farmers in Central America to plug them into supply chains to help them create greater profits from their yields. I launched a social impact business in East Africa to help small farmers move their product into a bigger supply chain to grocery stores. I launched that with a business partner, Anne. We went to high school together, and she had significant experience in East Africa as well. And some of those things, like some of that work, a lot of it's trial and error for people working on different models and ideas. We've seen that a lot with what's called, oh my gosh.
It happens.
Yeah. Microfinance is one of the areas that we see that. So it's like small lending to people who have either business ideas or existing businesses to kind of help them build their business or get them capital and help them access bigger markets or, some type of capital investment to improve their business. And there are all these models that we saw and critiqued and looked, and even in what we were working on, there are also just things that are going to go wrong. It's just like how it is. So it's also like, I think, approaching ideas in ways that we want to help people, as long as there's a mutual understanding that like things will fail. Things will not go well all of the time. And we need to be considerate of those things. Like those are just, it's the nature of trying. It's the nature of taking a risk. And as long, I think, as everybody understands the risks that are being taken together, and that's a collective effort, there's value in that. It doesn't mean it always turns out well, but
there's a difference in that.
There's
because value can still be developed even if the outcome wasn't what you had strived after or wasn't what you were aiming for.
Sure.
Interesting.
So
this wasn't your only experience in Africa, if I understand this right?
No, I would go, like, when I first went, it was like a couple weeks. Went back for like a month. Went back for like 4 months. Went back for 5 months. I was kind of back and forth over about 3 years. And then about 4 years ago, I was back working in the same field, and then was back for a couple week trip to shoot video and tell stories of entrepreneurs who are launching their own businesses and kind of the impact that an organization that I was working with was doing in Zambia. Over years, it's been, I don't know, it was just a handful of trips over years, back and forth, and trying to like really root myself too when I was doing the initial work. I was also, when I was in college, so I helped co-found some of the early work, was there back and forth, was kind of present. Things didn't end up working out between us, me and the other founder, and kind of based on perspective. And I just said, hey, these are the principles that I would really like to work under. And I feel like from what I've been able to read so far, even though I'm not an economist and I don't have my degree yet, but I'm working on learning everything that I can to do appropriate development and really help people. I don't feel like the model we're creating is helping people. I feel like it's hurting people. And I don't feel like it's leading them to greater opportunity. And it also felt like part of what we ran was a leadership program for students from the U.S. To go to Africa to do volunteer work and help a community, and then like really reflect on their own experiences, and then to bring those experiences back to kind of enter college, and shaped a lot. It actually ended up shaping a lot of those students, like what they chose to study. There's one guy that comes to mind who like was really inspired by the work that we saw in healthcare and came back and is now, I don't know if he's a surgeon, but he's a doctor now. And it was through that experience. So it was like really neat to see how we inspired people. But at the same time, I wasn't really content with the way in which the work was being done. So I separated myself from that, and just felt that I could keep learning and figuring out ways to do better and have better impact on people's lives without creating like collateral damage along the way.
And that's a really hard thing to go into something and invest in it and put time and effort into it, and then realize that the values and the principles that you want and that you uphold isn't universally upheld in this thing that you are creating, and making that split. That's a really hard call.
Yeah, it's hard to walk away from things like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, you're emotionally invested, you're relationally invested, you have communities, and I feel like I've always been a person who cares about being invested in people's lives and staying invested to the degree that you can. Obviously, like it's simply keeping up with people in this day and age. Like, yes, it's easier than it's ever been, and at the same time, when I was moving through time, like, we didn't have social media, we had email. You saw people and spent time with them when you were with them.
Yeah.
So that connection piece was very like live and interactive, rather than needing to bridge that through a digital sphere. So I think that there's so much that comes with being able to walk away from something that you feel has taken different shape and different light than what you started. And sometimes you got to pull the ripcord and say, I'm out.
Yeah.
Try to do that as well as you can, as appropriately as you can. Doesn't make it less heartbreaking usually. Usually there's loss as a part of that, both relationally, sometimes financially. You've invested time and energy and building relationships. Sometimes you sacrifice relationships and those things. So it was those experiences too had never really stopped to like investing in anything. And I had a venture, like I was saying before, with my business partners called Bio to Body. And it was a cooking oil company. We were based out of Rwanda, doing work in the Congo, Uganda, and Kenya to really help small farmers boost their profits, access a bigger supply chain. And that was a heartbreaking experience to have. We had the guy who was working for us in Africa ended up defrauding the company. He wrapped up a bunch of money in our product and just disappeared, basically. And our investors lost their money. I lost personal money and investment. It affected a lot of relationships because of those investors and trusting what was going on. And it was really difficult. Definitely one of the hardest things in my life to have to deal with in terms of business and personal.
Yeah, that
because it's both. It's
exactly
business and personal.
At that point, it's really integrated.
It is.
Like
I mean,
what we talked about.
Yeah, and especially because it's about livelihood. Like Anne and I co-founded this business because we wanted to improve the livelihood of farmers and figure out ways to not only improve the livelihood of farmers, but also create better agricultural practices surrounding the palm oil industry. We were particularly working in the palm oil industry, which is a highly controversial industry. There's a lot of misinformation about the palm oil industry. And palm oil actually originates on the African continent. We were really motivated to say, how are ways that we can influence the change of this industry to benefit the farmers, do less damage to the environment through agricultural practices, and grow a business that we've started ourselves that directly benefits these farmers and reinvests a lot of profit into these farmers.
Yeah.
And we had a handful of investors who were amazing. And the gentleman who worked for us was through personal connections, not my personal connections, but through my business partner's personal connections. There was a lot of trust built. There was a lot of time. There was a lot of invested time and money and research and other things. Different pieces to that. It was so multifaceted, and to see it come crashing down through dishonesty and just not taking responsibility and then stealing. It was just very tragic, and hurtful to relationships we had with people investing, obviously hurtful in the long term of like helping farmers. We just couldn't do what we were set out to do. Yeah. And it was very challenging. Yeah.
So in something like that, when you've invested so much into this and then it falls apart, or you have to pull the ripcord, or whatever happens, that it doesn't end up going how you wanted it, and to a point of, I don't want to say failure, but in a lot of senses failure.
Yeah, sure.
You learn a lot through it, but
it's a failure.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like hard to like. I see what you're saying, because like I'm pretty averse to using the word failure anyway. It's like lot of people want to use it as like personal motivation and be like, oh yeah, failure's good, don't fail. And it's like, yeah, that's true. I guess it's like a bigger question of like, what is success rather than like, it is failure. And knowing there were plenty of things that I learned in that I count as success that don't overall contribute to anything at this point about that business, but obviously contribute to things in my life now and my business partner's life. Hopefully on our investors, maybe in the people that we worked with there. So yeah, I mean, it's all kind of it's definitely hard to look at that though, without seeing the extreme loss.
Yeah.
And kind of coping with that experience. I mean, that was I was personally invested with a pretty significant amount of like my money into that.
Yeah.
That kind of all went away in a day. And I had like really moved away from other experiences, like other consulting work and projects I was working on to really focus on that. And then all of a sudden I was going to start paying myself, and our investors had approved that. I was going to focus on it. And then in one day it was just shot and gone. And then it was picking up the pieces. And this is over a year ago now, where we were just kind of left with like, how do we sort this out? And what is going to contribute to like fixing this? And I mean, months and months of therapy, which were amazing to work through that, of just coming to a point where I could, all right, this is what I lost and it hurts really badly and I'm broken from this because I worked really hard to make the money I made to invest into my own ideas. And then to have that pulled out underneath you due to someone else, something that's out of your control. Yeah. Which obviously, like a cornerstone of psychology and mental health is being able to understand and compartmentalize and separate what is in our control, what is out of our control. What do we do about the things that it's in our control? What do we do and how do we respond to the things that are out of our control? And I think that experience alone has taught me so much from that one business loss, but in other ways in life of just kind of constantly asking ourselves that question.
Yeah. So what are some other ways that you've been able to cope with that for other people who've gone through things like that?
I mean, I think having a community is really important, like my community of friends, and several of my friends have had similar experiences in business like that. Big losses, big shifts, personal investment, and just being able to have a community of people who can relate to that and empathize with it. I think that's the more important part. It's like people can listen and they can be sorry and they can be bummed, but it's a whole different story when someone's experienced the same thing and they've had personal investment and time and energy lost at the hand of someone who's irresponsible and neglectful, and just doesn't seem to care about what you provided them at the same time. And I think there's so much to learn too about how we develop trust and what we do, how we kind of respond and move toward risk or away from risk in those things. And I just think it's reshaped a little bit about how I approach certain things that I want to create and take certain risks or not. And I think overall, though, when I look back, I think a lot of people say, oh, I wouldn't change anything. It's like, no, I would change things. I would have done things differently. I would have probably chosen some big different ways of doing things and trusting different people with making certain decisions. But those are things now that are out of my control. And instead, choosing to look back and say, that experience is what happened. I can do nothing about that now. I can keep trying to reconcile certain things, which I only have so much capacity for. But I think, I think it's really about sitting and focusing on the things that are not in our control. And learning that from like a psychological perspective. And then also finding motivation in what else could be future opportunities.
After a loss like that, the motivation's got to be really hard to find, I imagine.
Yeah, I think it took months and months and months of rest and frustration and dealing with hate. That was like one of the things that was really hard for me, to hate the person who really destroyed this and these relationships and what I worked to build with my business partner. And coping with hate is hard. It's a horrible feeling. It's an awful feeling. It makes me sick to think about hating someone. but I also found myself in a place where I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't call it something else because it is what it was. I hated him. And I was so angry at what he did and his dishonesty and his inability of being a good communicator after we were introduced through personal relationships, which then obviously had fallout in other ways. So, I think it was a lot of it was navigating those painful experiences, those feelings, what, kind of shaped how I saw that experience and then what I was going to do about it.
Got you. I think that's mine. Yeah, sorry about that.
So yeah, I mean, a lot of it's just, I think, moving through those experiences, being very reflective on who we are, being able to ground ourselves in considering the things that are in our control or are not in our control. I think for me, it was important to like recover financially, to work really hard, to jump back into other work and other consulting and other projects, to just hustle.
Yeah. After you've pulled out so much and you were literally right on that cusp, start paying yourself and do this full time. That was your focus. That's a horrible point to for it all to come crashing down.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot more people than me have lost a lot more too. But I think with all these relative experiences, like people often tend to cope with things that go wrong, or like in sharing that with people of being like, well, yeah, but at least this didn't happen, or it wasn't this bad. And it's like, no one needs to focus on things that it wasn't. We got to focus on things that it was. And it's a very individual experience for someone. And for me, fortunately, I had a lot of people who were very supportive and didn't use language like that. Some people did, but I think it's like more of learning. I've learned now how to support people who are going through that myself. And I've learned I feel like thoughtful and kind ways to support people through loss, business loss, personal relationships, other things like that through that experience. And I think that has ongoing value for the rest of my life. So I'd say those things are takeaways for me where it's like, okay, like I really want to recover financially. I really want to save this money back so I can reinvest it and do other things with it. I want to pivot and get back to working on things that can pay me and do have value in return for my time. I want to keep focusing on entrepreneurial work that I want to start and manage myself, be a part of new teams and build different relationships professionally. Just like was a big pivot and big change.
Has that been a difficult thing? Like how difficult was that? Because I'm sure it has. Being able to trust other people in a business sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think I there's a degree that I've like ongoingly mourned that experience, and then in doing so, I've been kind of definitely a bit more probably standoffish about certain risks, about certain I've friends who work in online retail and selling online products who have been like, hey, like try some of these ideas with getting involved in an Amazon business or doing something. And I'm just risk averse when it comes to certain things right now. And I think I've also just come to be okay with that too. Just say like at certain times we're going to be willing to take certain risk and other times we're not. And that's how life's going to go anyway. Having that flexible self-identity. Yeah. That's difficult. No. It is. I think it takes a lot to develop. I think it takes a lot to maintain. And I think we also like have to cut ourselves some slack a little bit and be like, can't constantly look back on decisions we made and say like, I hate that I made that decision. What a dumb decision. Why did I do that? Blah, blah, blah. It's more of like, okay, now if I was ever put in this position again with some of these decisions, I may make them differently. And I think it's about learning and really caring for ourselves and how we make decisions, being patient with ourselves and learning better new ways to cope with loss. That can be from a financial loss. It can be from losing a business. It could be from losing friendships or business relationships. But just learning ways to move forward and kind of never stop grinding to keep going for what you're going for. Yeah. And that feels good. It's not easy. Yeah. But it feels good to like make steps that feel progressive to accomplishing more. Exactly, and stopping that cycle. Yeah. Because it's very cyclical and it's very dark. And when you're in the midst of that loss, like I would never want to return to those months of my life. I would also never want anyone I know to ever have to go through that.
Yeah.
I know that what I've gone through now, I'm grateful that I can at least support other friends and entrepreneurs and people who are taking those risks or who do suffer from loss, and know how to be caring in those things and supportive, and collaborative. I think that's another big piece of just like learning how to refocus and say, like, just because collaboration with one person or group of people didn't work doesn't mean you threw out the whole thing.
And that's something that's something I've done for years, is like, if one thing doesn't work, then you throw out the whole pie. You're like, nope, not going to touch this has a bitter taste in my mouth, everything's done with that.
Right.
That's really hard to work through.
Yeah,
that's really hard.
Yeah.
But I think you're right, the value that comes from that work, that's not easy, not at all easy, but the value that comes from taking that step by step, and then giving yourself that patience and that acceptance and saying, yeah, I am a lot more risk averse now after going through this.
Yeah. And I've also just like rearranged goals. Like I had goals that were a part of that experience, and I was really gunning toward them with my business partner and with the people we had involved. And as they kind of fizzled away, I let those goals fizzle in a good way. I let them go. Because I think that was also something I was holding on to, was like, this affects this goal of mine, so I can't achieve this goal now. Okay, maybe I actually just need to realign my goals and what I'm trying to do. And I think there's so much that we constantly have to pivot with who we want to become and what we're working toward, to one, be present, and not always be thinking about the future or what we want to create, because then sometimes we'll never enjoy it, or we'll never actually get to certain goals or accomplish certain things. And I think those were huge pieces to learn of, okay, maybe I have different goals in this now, and let's rethink this. And I want to rethink this as to the things that I want and I need. And kind of go, I mean, I think to a degree it's self-preservation. And so it's somewhat natural, but it's also like, doesn't mean that we have an answer to how to do those things. And that takes a lot of reflection and a lot of long conversations with ourselves to really navigate the goals we have and what we want to do and how we want to do it and things that we want in life.
It's very true. And having that self-reflection, to be able to look back with that patience, that's difficult and crucial.
Yeah,
yeah,
for sure.
Dang. So I want to take this in a slightly different direction. Because I know we spent most of the last podcast talking about loss, and we've jumped right back in here. I was listening to it. I was like, wow, we spent like an hour talking about that,
wow.
which it's very eye-opening. And then we just spent this chunk opening up talking about that.
Yeah.
And that's very humbling. It's very humbling to hear that. And so I would love to shy away from that now.
Sure.
I think we've...
Happier times.
Exactly. So you have talked to me at one point about this idea of starting a podcast. Yeah, there's something you called the Millions and Billions. Is that right?
The Millions and Billions Dilemma.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's a fantastic idea, but why don't you explain it?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of came about, I was having conversations with several friends, also with my brother. We're pretty close and talk about a number of things. One of the things that I was probably first being reflected over was the federal budget. Was something that really stirred this pot. When I was looking at the breakdown of the federal budget, and I was like, wow, it's like really hard to comprehend how big these dollars are. These are a lot of zeros. And it's very relative, right? Like we just don't necessarily think of things. I mean, we're normal people. We have an income. We live on a monthly basis. We pay our bills. We try to save. We think about things like retirement or investments or buying a property or different things like that.
Yeah, I got you. You can go right ahead.
Just go off. Just go off on.
Perfect. Just like that. We're recording with one camera. That turns off every 30 minutes, which is why we gotta do that. Okay.
And I think in a lot of those conversations, my brother with my friends talking about really big budgets, and this is also something I've come into in my own work with consulting, like whether it's like looking at finances or looking at budgets of a business or a nonprofit, just really working to understand bigger numbers and how the more we can understand bigger numbers, the millions and the billions, trillions as well, that's in there.
That's
a really
that's
big number,
way out there.
Right.
Yeah.
The better we can likely vote, policies that we want to support, how we want to see society change, understanding a little bit more about economics and investments, and just understanding here's the pie, here are the slices of the pie. And that's one thing if the pie is 100, and then we can be like, okay, a quarter of 100 is 25%. Okay, I can like get that. But when we're looking at a pie and it's like, this pie is $2.5 trillion. And this portion of the pie is like $80 billion. And everyone's like, I don't know what that means. Like, you know, and and I always joke with people like, and when you talk big numbers, right, it's like everyone's like deer in the headlights. And it's like, that's all right, whatever. I'm going to go focus on my normal life and the things that I need to do. And like we had said before in the other podcast, oftentimes people too are mostly concerned with survival because of the times. And so people don't have the luxury of contemplating some of these things, which makes sense. But in being able to communicate that about those things with like my brother, my friends, I think that there's value in talking to people who understand those bigger numbers and how they play a part of our system and our policies, our state, our cities, our counties, our federal government, the global economy, and really trying to understand how do these things work. People get really critical of like CEO salaries. CEO salaries are often relative to maybe the total revenue that an organization or business brings in, or the profits or other pieces. So I think it would also help people make more critical. It would bring about more critical thought on how organizations, businesses, nonprofits, other things are structured, how money is used, and what that means to be a part of a bigger whole. And I think that it has value because it is hard to understand that. It's overwhelming to look at numbers that big. But we shouldn't let the complexity of something keep us from trying to understand it. And trying to bring people into the fold. The idea with the podcast would be to bring people on who have their own either professional background or experiences in like financial institutions or in business or in accounting, to kind of help people understand the layers of those large numbers and how they play a role in the bigger picture.
So what started your fascination with this? Because this is a very unique idea. It's fairly obvious idea that like people don't understand the millions and the billions and then trillions. It doesn't comprehend. And it's obvious in the sense that, people really don't understand that.
I mean, I think like when I really started to evaluate, so like, well, we use terms like wealth, right? And wealth, often people are like, oh, wealth, that's for people who have a lot. It's like wealth building is the creation of wealth at any level, regardless of what level that may be. Creating savings is creating wealth. So like wealth doesn't mean you have to have a certain amount of assets or know a certain amount of things. It's what are you doing to create things in your life that have certain value that contribute to the life that you want to live. Oftentimes we talk about wealth, we mean that from a financial perspective, fiscal, but obviously wealth is in a lot of ways, relationships, money, other things. But when I'm really touching on this, I'm really focused on the numbers because the numbers are big. They're overwhelming. When I really started to think about things I wanted to be involved in, when I left full-time work, it's probably been 4 years now, to work independently, start consulting. I started a media company to do storytelling. Started working on other ideas, just kind of constantly irons in the fire, working on ideas, working on projects, learning a lot. And I moved to a small community in Washington, which I think I'd actually touched on in the last podcast as well. It was a small kind of rural community. And it was shortly after the election, like I said. So it was, I was really interested in being a part of a smaller community and understanding how people in a rural town in America thought about the world. And I think in doing so, it made me interested in how much money from the federal government, the state, the county goes into communities like this. What resources exist, especially from like a healthcare perspective. I'm diagnosed with general anxiety disorder, panic disorder, was diagnosed with depression. And as I started going through my own experiences with mental health and physical health, understanding the complexities surrounding numbers and budgets and costs with healthcare. And so kind of seeing these things made me very interested in the bigger numbers. Oh, this project costs X amount of money. Okay, well, that's just a number. Like, what are the pieces of that make up that whole? And what are justified? And that again goes on the level of municipalities and cities and communities of like how much things cost and what are we actually investing and what are we voting to spend money on? We have to do that all the time. And I think in time I started kind of thinking it the millions and billions dilemma idea just from stepping up to those really big numbers and realizing like a billion is 1,000 million, a trillion is 1,000 billion. Like really beginning to look at that and be like, okay, like I can kind of understand this. And the more I can understand, if me, who is like, I don't have a degree in finance, I don't have a degree in accounting. If I can start to understand some of these things as just like a normal person, more and more people can understand these things and it can inform the way that they make decisions. It can inform the way that they vote. It can inform the policies that they vote into law. It can inform the budgets that they vote on to support government spending from taxation or private business spending from a budget. Like it informs the greater whole. And I think that more people would gain knowledge to inform how to make decisions surrounding larger budgets and money from a podcast like that.
That's a beautiful idea.
Thanks.
Beautiful idea. I really hope this goes down because I, for one, I have very little experience with numbers that big. I would be stoked. I would learn a lot.
I'm interested to see. I have a couple of people who have already kind of volunteered and said, "Hey, I would actually would like to introduce you to some people I think would be really valuable on that." I have a friend who's an economist who I would like to talk to, and finance, investing, and other areas to just kind of discuss the greater whole. So
exactly.
I have to get to a place to be able to like do that.
Yeah.
So who knows when it'll come, but yeah, I mean, it's something that I think is worth exploring. I think it's worth helping people learn and be informed on.
And that's one thing that like, it doesn't just affect, how people view government spending. It doesn't just affect how people view this spending, different budgets. It affects everything, how you view different companies, like you said, CEOs' salaries, which is a really big thing right now. A lot of companies are getting bad publicity because all of a sudden they're saying, oh, this CEO makes X millions of dollars salary, and people are freaking out. And then without actually looking at the underlying causes and seeing, okay, well, this company is bringing in like 5 billion and they're only making like $1 million, 2 million. Like that's significant, like a significantly small portion of the whole.
Yeah. And I think it goes on the levels of like government spending, taxation, business. Obviously that also converts over to like international numbers of like, okay, well, what about when currency's being traded? And what about when something here is affecting a trade deal in another country? What do those things look like? And when we're putting tariffs on imports at the billions of dollars, how much is that of the total? And then so how much can we expect that will affect the total? And just to get people thinking, like I also would learn a lot. So I don't know a lot. That's why I want to do this. I just know from what I've seen and what I've read and what I've been able to learn myself. And obviously the more we learn, the more we realize we don't know.
Exactly
what
what
we
I
want
was
to
gonna
know.
say.
So
yeah, that's one of my favorite things about doing this is I can sit down with you and I can talk about loss, and I can really learn so much more about how to deal with loss than I've ever known in my life. I can sit down and with my brother and Justin Ray that I just sat down with like 20 minutes ago before I came here, and we can talk about how to build wealth when you don't have a lot. When you have like 15, 30 grand a year, how are you going to build wealth? Different ways that I can be like, okay, this is how I can apply that to my life. This is how I can teach my friends. This is how we can, as a society, we can build wealth. It doesn't have to be this thing that you, like we talked about earlier, it doesn't have to be this thing that like you have to have $1 million or 6 figures to start creating.
Sure.
You can literally learn so much just through the process. It's my favorite thing about this.
Yeah. That's cool.
Yeah. Oh, it's a blast.
Yeah.
So when you left your full-time job, you said about 4 years ago, right? Okay. And then you started consulting, you started doing freelance work, you built your own media company.
Yeah. I had a business partner with the media company. We started out of my house, had a lot of local clients. Worked with a physical therapy office. We worked at the local bike shop, worked with the local nonprofit, a solar company, online retail. It was cool. Like, and I was doing a lot of storytelling. That's what a lot was focused on kind of initially.
And that's huge. So many businesses need that.
Yeah.
And so what was that step like for you? Going from a full-time to all of a sudden, okay, now I have my hand in like 5 different things, but this is me. Like, I'm not relying on other people to make my hours, to make my schedule, to make my income.
Oh, it was scary. Mostly. Yeah, I mean, it was just risk. I had been spending, at that point, I had probably spent about 2 years really thinking about the risks that I was willing to take to find joy in my life. That was the most important thing to me. What am I willing to do? What am I willing to sacrifice? How do I want to go about opportunity, income, where I live, my community? What risks am I willing to take? What risks am I not willing to take? And what will ultimately bring me joy in my life? I feel like we're always kind of looking beyond ourselves to something that's next, like the famous saying, the grass is always greener, things like that. And I really love some of my work. I always love people that I worked with because I just like people, but I was not happy. Ultimately, and some of that had also been from developing anxiety disorder, depression, certain health issues, and I was feeling all of those things at the same time of not really feeling like I was doing what I wanted to be doing with my professional life. So a lot of things coming to head at the same time, and it was scary. And adds a certain component of stress to have to make your way yourself. And I think a lot of that has to do with, especially when you're doing something on your own, you don't really have safety nets. It's like, okay, if this doesn't work, I don't have anyone that I can just depend on to get money to pay my bills. Like, it's like, I'm going to do this and I'm going to make a certain amount of money and I'm going to make things happen, or I'm not. And
it's a lot of responsibility, like personal responsibility. You're forced to take.
Yeah, and it's just it's on you. But I also enjoy that a lot, and I also, in time, it's helped me have more conversations with people in my family, my mom, my dad, my grandparents, other people, to learn about kind of their entrepreneurial visions and things they've done in the past, and learning all of this history and seeing people like my brother. My brother's an incredibly hard worker. And we have gone about things pretty differently in terms of what we've done, but he's such a motivation for me because of how hard he works and how he focuses on what he's doing. But learning efficiency, I think, was a big part of that transition, and knowing what you're doing, admitting what you don't know.
That's hard.
Big part of it.
That's a really hard one for a lot
It's
of
hard.
people.
I mean, it's hard for me. Like, we have to come through these experiences where we are willing to be very honest with ourselves about what we know and what we don't know. And I've never found more value than being able to admit, no matter who it's to or about what we don't know, what I don't know. And then also, in doing so and admitting, you can then choose a path of learning to learn things that you don't know that you want to learn. Before I started the media company, this is like really funny. On one of our first projects, I went to Africa with 2 friends to film these initial stories. I was working for an organization at the time, And when we were going, I remember being on the plane and sitting next to Ryan, one of my videographers and writers, and I was like, hey, what do I call myself
Right.
in doing all of this? Like, I knew nothing about what I was doing, but I also knew that I just wanted to figure it out. And I was okay with that and comfortable with that. So I think it's a lot of risk. It's a lot of discomfort. No one's going to do anything for you. If you're going to make money, you're going to do it yourself. If you're going to have work, you're going to find it yourself.
Yeah.
You don't make everyone happy in the process. You mess things up. It's learning. It's learning to be patient with yourself. So those were, a number of things that I kind of learned and how it felt to make that transition happen into working for myself and setting my own schedule and becoming more efficient, which was the idea. If I can do something that takes a normal person 20 hours to do and I can do it in 10 and I can charge a livable wage, I can have pretty good balance in life to do some of the things that I want to do. So that's what I've spent those years doing. And it's a lot of learning. I've had a lot of failure, true failure. I've lost a lot. I've gained a lot. I've learned a lot. I feel much more equipped in my professional life now. And it's helped me navigate and think a lot about what I want out of life. Not to be thinking about what I want in 40 years, but what I want now. And how I can be. It's also like caused me to be more reflective about building close relationships with my family, with caring deeper about my friends, like building and navigating intimate relationships and a personal relationship. So all of those things matter to me, and it's given me time to be thoughtful about those things, and I wouldn't trade that for anything, for sure.
Yeah, that's huge. That's incredible. And I think a lot of people, they look at entrepreneurship and they look at the idea of stepping out of a full-time job and as this terrifying thing. I know entrepreneurship is becoming trendy. It's becoming this thing, and it's like everyone is a entrepreneur. If you see entrepreneur in there, if they see entrepreneur in their like description or whatever in their bio, most of the time it doesn't mean that they're out there making a livable wage for themselves. But then to see someone actively who's done that for years, and then to see what that lifestyle is like the pros of it anyway.
Yeah, and I guess a big piece of that is like you got to start somewhere.
Yes.
Like,
could not agree more.
You have to, and you're like, you choose what risks you want to take. Some people want to leave full-time work and jump straight into it. Some people want to work full-time and add so. And I started doing some of this work while I still was working full-time. I just had to carve out time for it, and it meant working after work, into evenings, into weekends, to like create certain foundational things for it. And that's just a part of the process. And that was a baby step into that risk and creating my own personal safety nets for taking those risks. And honestly, for some people too, who want to do that, it also may not work out. Things won't always work out. And it doesn't mean that we see those things as total losses. It means we see them as experiences. And that can better define what we do next. If it's not a business we start or an organization or something we're doing, and maybe it doesn't work out. So you got to pivot. You got to do something else.
That progressive learning.
Yeah, maybe you have to go work part-time. Maybe you have to go back to work full-time. But I do know that like there is something that I've really valued about even taking the risk and doing what I've been able to do with the business partners that I've had and with the friends that I've made and with the work that I've had, those clients and different people. It's neat.
It's that same idea. It's like like you set extraordinarily high goals. I think it's audacious, like big, hairy, and audacious goals is a big one that entrepreneurs throw around. It's a big term. You set these crazy goals, not necessarily so that you can achieve them, but so that you become the kind of person who can achieve them. And there's a difference. It's that same thing when you take this risk. You're taking this risk, and if it doesn't pan out the way you like, okay, that's not necessarily the end all be all, but you become the person who is okay with taking that risk.
Yeah.
And that's a journey, and that's a difficult one, but that's a beautiful one.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to say on here? Anything else you'd like to tell the people?
I don't think so. Hi, people.
I love it, man. Next time I'm in Colorado, I'm definitely gonna hit you up again for this.
That'd be great.
Yeah,
Of course.
Austin. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I feel really honored. Appreciate it. Cool.